morning. Thank you so much for tuning in to Bite Live 2020. This is Progress, an event series where in a year unlike any other, we are determined to focus on the issues that really matter, both to the industry and to society at large. My name is Nicola Kemp and I'm editorial director at Creative Brief. And this year, Bite Live is focused on the people, both in our industry and beyond it, really making a difference. The best and worst of how we deal with race as a society is exaggerated in sport. Sport provides a shared cultural touchpoint that brings together diverse communities in passion, pain, and joy. It's a point of shared connection which has a unique power to change the narrative. If the Black Lives Matter movement has taught us anything this year, it is that to make meaningful change, it is no longer good enough to be not racist. We need to be anti-racist, actively combating racism all of the time. From basketball superstar LeBron James driving voter registration to footballing powerhouse Marcus Rashford teaching British politicians what leadership really looks like, the current turmoil has shone a light on the sporting role models who are so much more multifaceted and influential than any one-dimensional stereotype of strength or sporting prowess would suggest. At a time when sport has more cultural influence than ever, how do we change the narrative in sport? And what can brands, agencies, and the creative industries as a whole do to accelerate change? To delve into this discussion, I have a brilliant panel of experts with me today. Professor Ben Carrington is an internationally renowned British sociologist currently working in the United States of America. He is widely regarded as one of the world's leading scholars on the sociology of race and culture, especially in relation to popular culture and sport. He embarked on his academic career after Charlton Athletic Football Club made a disastrous decision to not take him on as a professional footballer. A decision many experts, including Ben himself, believe may well have set Charlton back at least a decade. Michael Johnson is England's current under-21 football coach and also the owner of the best Zoom backdrop on this discussion. He has made over 550 appearances in the Football League and the Premier League, including playing more than 250 games for Birmingham City. And he's also played for the Jamaican national team. And Matt Readman, like Ben, Matt started his interest in this subject studying sociology and the psychology of sport at Loughborough University, although it took him into the world of agency life, not academia. He is currently head of strategy at Dark Horses, and he was previously strategy director at WCRS and Analog Folk. He has worked with brands including Sky, Nike, and the Olympics, and he recently wrote a thought-provoking article on how advertising has fueled racist myths in sport, which provided the creative spark for this discussion. So thank you so much for joining us. So to kick off, I'd really like to start with kind of why this issue is important. So Ben, I'd love to kick off with you if that's okay. Could you explain the myth of the Black athlete in sport and the challenges that the industry faces in facing up to it?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be a part of the discussion. And I'd like to thank Matt in particular for kind of helping to initiate and to lead this important discussion within the advertising industry. So some historical context briefly. So there are certain myths that were developed during the colonial period. So the period which we can date maybe from the 16th and 17th century onwards, when Britain and other empires expanded their reach around the world. And we see in this moment the kind of the formation of this idea that Black people are not fully human. There's a kind of there are anthropologists and writers and travelers propagate this notion. There's a hierarchy within humanity, and at the top are white Europeans, and there's various other races, and at the bottom are Black Africans. And this becomes widespread common knowledge throughout much of British and European society. And at the heart of this there's this kind of this way of looking at the world, this kind of racialized lens of looking at the world, are a number of myths about Blackness. So one of them is this idea that Black Africans aren't fully developed, that they're on the kind of chain of humanity, they're kind of stuck somewhere between primates, animals, gorillas, monkeys, and then on the other end you have European man, and Black people seem to be somewhere kind of stuck betwixt the two. And it leads to a series of myths about Blackness, and Blackness therefore gets associated with these animalistic tropes. So Black people seem to be hyper-aggressive, strong, violent, powerful, and also to some degree hypersexual. So there's this kind of notion of Blackness being associated with kind of violence and hypersexuality. And beneath that is this idea that this is a threat to civilization, and civilization is understood to be white European cultural mores and aesthetics, etc. Now, around the same time as these kind of ideas are populating, we see the emergence of modern sports. So as we know, many of the world's major sports were codified in Britain, and Britain kind of exports games around the world. So what we have here is a really interesting convergence of the emergence of modern sports and these highly racialized ways of understanding humanity. And in places like America, where I live in Los Angeles, we see forms of racial segregation in sports. So Black and white people competed separately. That tends to be less the case in the UK. But what did emerge was this idea that Black people were naturally good at sports. This begins to emerge in the early 20th century because they're more like animals. We know animals are fast. Cheetahs can run fast. We know that a gorilla is really strong. So we have this emergence of this idea that Black success in sports is not due to hard work or perseverance or any kind of cognitive ability to understand the game, but that Black people have a natural propensity to running fast, to jumping high, to throw in a punch, etc. And it's a really powerful myth. And it is a myth. It's based on a false understanding of humanity and the diversity of the races, and even the idea that the races themselves are artificially constructed. So that kind of seeps into how we understand sports. And it seemed to be proved when we, for example, look at certain sports and see disproportionate numbers of Black people playing certain sports. So there's this kind of complex reasons why that kind of wider racialized discourse, sports helps to propagate that. And then as we'll come on to discuss, the advertising industries sometimes inadvertently end up reproducing highly problematic racial stereotypes and gendered stereotypes. And hopefully we'll get into that conversation in a moment. But that there's a kind of backdrop to the early formation of ideas about race within Western societies that sports seems to kind of reproduce, if you like. It kind of confirms some of these assumptions. And the complex reasons as to why you have more Black people playing football and athletics rather than other sports is kind of forgotten. That the complex social reasons are underplayed, and we kind of foreground this kind of biological explanation. So, but the problem as well is that those stereotypes don't just apply to sports. Those stereotypes can apply to every Black person. So it's not just that we have stereotypes about Black people in sports, but the idea that every Black person is basically an athlete waiting to come out. And so these ideas actually affect and shape all Black people. And in many ways, it's not just about them affecting Black people, they affect how white people see Black people and how Black people see themselves. These stereotypes become internalized. So it's a very complex social historical process. And if we're not aware of that history, we can, in our professional lives, end up reproducing certain stereotypes because they become naturalized. They become so commonplace, we don't even see them as stereotypes, which is why I think Matt's essay earlier this year in Campaign was a really important one for people to think about and to read, even though many of us will say like these discussions and debates have been happening elsewhere for many, many years and many, many decades. And I think the current moment, as you outlined, Nikki, kind of gives this a greater urgency for us to address this.
Thank you, Ben, for that introduction, and particularly kind of the insight into stereotypes, because advertising in particularly has relied on stereotypes as sort of shortcuts to kind of connect with people, but actually is not connecting, in many ways doing the opposite. Michael, I'd really like to bring you in here and get your view as an athlete and also as a coach. How are stereotypes and cultural barriers impacting players, both in your own journey and on players sort of coming up now as well?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for mentioning my backdrop. I'll keep that there for future reference. It's an interesting point, and I'm glad that Ben's laid out the parameters of the discussion there, because I think it really gives my points a little bit more traction. So I'm going to just mention from a player and then a coach's aspect. From a player's aspect, black players are always put in certain positions on the field. I know in America, there's issues around black players going into the quarterback position. In England, that would be centre midfield. And it's two kind of traits for a centre midfield position. One, you can be intelligent and, you've got creativity and leadership skills, which promote yourself as a captain. And the other one is that you break up play, you're a destroyer, you're a tough tackling midfielder. And the other positions that predominantly are held by black people is wide positions because they're quick, or centre back position because you need to be strong. And in terms of a player, you always, when you see academies come together, you'll always find that black players automatically find themselves in certain positions based on the concept of the coach. We'll put them in that wide position because he's quick. We'll put them in that defensive position because he's strong. But the positions where you're talking about intelligence and creativity, there are very few black players that find themselves within that. And then that leads itself to when you retire, how do you then go upstairs into a leadership position when all of your career, the tone around your career has been around your traits of being powerful, of being quick, of being explosive. So if we look at someone like Lukaku, very few people know that Lukaku knows 6 languages and has got master's degrees. But Lukaku's always described as powerful, explosive, even a beast. But not the words of intelligent, the words of creativity are not described around him. And as I said, that has problems then when you're trying to access a leadership position after your days are retired. And then when you do retire as a coach, as a player, now as a coach, as a manager, it's very hard to break that ceiling because you are no longer the athlete with those traits. We're now looking at leadership positions. And if senior decision makers that don't look like me are all white old men and have that trait about how they perceive black people to be, it's very difficult to break into managerial positions, chief executive positions where you're supposed to lead, but you've always been told you're just quick, you're powerful, you're strong, you're explosive.
It's really, I mean, it's so interesting, and the stereotypes and how they're kind of holding players back and not creating an equal playing field. In your position as a coach, do you feel that that is changing? Do you see positive change, like it for this generation of players, or is it still the playing field is not level?
Well, let me just say this. England's missed out on a generation of quality coaches. I look at people like Andy Cole, who's Man United legend. I think he's the 3rd highest goal scorer in the Premier League ever. Yeah, Andy Cole had to go to Macclesfield Town, which is at the bottom of the English professional pyramid, to get a chance. Other black players just want to walk away from the game because of the lack of opportunities. So what we're finding is those players that are now coming towards the end of their career are more often than likely looking down the agency route or actually going into the media. There's 33% of black players are actually playing the game in England, yet there's only 4% and less in managerial positions, 2% in senior leadership positions. By senior leadership positions, I mean sporting director, chief exec, financial directors. And when you go into the boardroom, it's non-existent. So the challenges are quite clearly set out for us, that you can see the disparity between playing the game, but then there's a problem now when you start to transition, and all those traits now are no longer any good because you're now retiring, you know, the height of your career is behind you. Now you need to lead on your leadership skills, which many people don't think Black players actually have.
And Matt, I'd really like to bring you in here to get sort of an industry perspective, because it's clearly like a massive missed opportunity here. And we've seen brands begin to make an impact in terms of things like equal sponsorship, and where they put their money does matter. So what's your view in terms of why should this issue matter to marketers?
Yeah, thanks for that. And it's fascinating to hear you guys talk already, so thanks. You know, I think just to be really clear from the outset, I don't think this is about, you know, criticizing or anything that we're currently doing within marketing. I think the most important thing about this conversation is this specific conversation. So not just racism in sport, but the myth of the Black athlete. Is it's so important because it underpins everything, yet it's so misunderstood or not even recognized. So really, I think the reason why I wrote this article originally was to try and just make people more aware of this and think about it. And I think, you know, Ben talked about, in his book, he's talked about sort of the role of the sports media and fan discourse and advertising all helping to fuel this. I don't know whether he'd agree or not. I would argue potentially that advertising isn't quite as guilty as, let's say, some punditry or commentary and hasn't been in the past. Yet there's obviously a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and particularly to help understand this. And I think, you know, my sell to the industry would be around like 2 points really. Like one is around sort of like an obligation to do something around this. And I genuinely believe that sports advertising can make the world a better place. And some people might sniff at that, and there's people within the industry that love to talk about, you know, no one really cares about advertising. I would disagree, particularly with sports advertising. There's plenty of examples in recent times that have made people feel extraordinary emotions. And I think there is a real kind of need and opportunity for us to actually sort of help address this issue in particular. And the other side of that would be more about opportunity. And we're always looking for sort of creative opportunities. And for me, as a sort of a planner and a strategist, we're always looking for insights. And the best insights of attention are the ones where something's staring you right in the face, but no one really notices it. And this is a perfect example of that. You know, this is just crazy when you hear, you know, Ben and Michael talk about what they just talked about. The idea that you start to question everything. You say, well, actually, that's totally true. We do think about these athletes in certain ways, and that does make total sense. And that's where you get really powerful kind of creative ideas from as well. So, you know, what if we can start to flip that script a little more and not just create campaigns which seemingly tackle the kind of overt and easy to tackle issues, right? So it's easy to go out and say, okay, you know, this type of racism is abhorrent and we're going to tackle it in the campaign. You know, it's much harder to go out there and say, okay, this is a real kind of subtle underlining force in the kind of world today, and we're going to really tackle that. But I think the creative fruits of that will be that much higher because suddenly you'll, you know, flip the script, suddenly you'll start to show things in different ways. And I think that's been done really well in a lot of campaigns with, you know, around gender empowerment in the last sort of 5 years or so. And I think it's about time we start to really use advertising to probe this myth and to really sort of debunk it and unveil it for what it is. It is complete fiction. So I think that's the really kind of exciting opportunity for marketing in particular.
Thanks, Matt. And Ben, I'd love to get your view on this and on Matt's point as well, that, you know, that there is perhaps an opportunity here for brands, and we've seen more brands bring their platforms to a more diverse range of people. Do you think that brands have a role when it comes to sort of challenging racist stereotypes? I mean, is there a role for business to accelerate change?
Absolutely, yeah. Can I be a bit provocative here for the audience and to gently push back a little bit against Matt? So there could be an argument. Let me put this as an argument, a provocation to our listeners. That historically, one of the ways in which racist ideas about Black people, the central idea, as I suggested, that Black people aren't fully human, You know, this is the Black Lives Matter is simply to say Black people are human, and it's an indictment in 2020 that should be a controversial position, or that we've finally come to recognize that. But if we go back to the 19th century and we look at the early formation of, you know, of marketing and packaging, it was part of the broader advertising industries. The ways in which companies like Pears Soap would market their products would be to show a Black person being cleaned by a white baby in order to make them white, which meant they were finally becoming civilized. There would be advertising campaigns of a Man Friday, you know, discovering a bar of Pears Soap, and the slogan will be "Civilization begins." So there's an argument to say that actually, especially in the 19th century and early 20th century, advertising and the packaging of racism, what academics sometimes refer to as commodity racism, the ways in which racism became commodified and locked onto commodities, was propagated more by advertising than any other sphere. More than, you know, because you can write a screed about, you know, about Black people, but only certain people could read it. So actually, I think advertising has a really pivotal role to play, sometimes more pivotal than other areas. And, you know, as Matt referred to, when you look at the history of advertising around gender in the 20th century, some of the most grotesque forms of sexual objectification, misogyny is replete within the advertising industries. And it's horrendous when we look at it now and we have that kind of, oh my God, what were they thinking? And at the same time, the most grotesque forms of racial stereotypes onto packaging, onto, you know, and we're seeing this getting played out right now, you know, the kind of, the Aunt Gemma, you know, the kind of the grotesque forms of mimicry of Blackness. Advertising played a central role in this for most of the 20th century, and it needs to be held account. Now, the flip side, of course, is now it can play the role in the other way. And I think this is why this is the kind of the reckoning I think that we're trying to think through now. So that the question is, what are those forms of racial stereotyping and gender stereotyping, but particularly racial stereotyping, that we don't see now, that in 20 years time, when I'm teaching these courses like I do to my students and I show them advertising from 2020, they'll be thinking, what were they thinking? Like, that was so clearly problematic. And I say this to my students when I show them advertisements from the 70s, and they say, that's so clearly sex. I mean, it's not even sex, this is just misogynistic, you know, men walking over women, all the sexual innuendos. When I show my students, the American students, the Flake commercials from the 60s and 70s, you know, they're like, how could you get away with that really clear, sexualized way of kind of selling chocolate? And I say to them, okay, what will the students 20 years from now be saying about us today? And I think this is what Matt's trying to get us to kind of to reckon with and to grapple with. So absolutely. And then I had a good conversation with Mark Pritchard, who I'm sure many of your viewers are aware of. You know, so Mark is a global marketing officer for Procter & Gamble. He's in charge of a budget of nearly $9 billion. So in your industry, like Procter & Gamble is a huge, huge player, as you know. But Mark Pritchard has been very clear for the past few years that Procter & Gamble and the advertising of all of their, you know, their various divisions will be committed to actively rectifying a number of really problematic ways in which they reinforce stereotypical gender norms and racial norms. You know, so they did a few years ago, they did the Gillette did the We Believe, I think I Believe campaign, or We Believe campaign, and to try to challenge, you know, in the wake of Me Too. But one of the things I like that Mark Pritchard has done, there's also a series of adverts that they did around the look and the talk that aired more in the US, but I'm sure you're familiar with them in the UK, which was precisely to say there are forms of racial bias in America, and advertising plays an active role in reinforcing those forms of bias. How can we make sure that in every aspect of what we do as a company, we're going to make sure that not only are we not reproducing forms of racial bias, but we're actively going to produce campaigns that show the full humanity of Black people, you know, and people of color more generally. So I think, you know, as I say, I think you could make an argument that for much of the 20th century, advertising has been complicit with the reproduction of gross forms of anti-Black racism. There's lots of evidence to support that. I also think at this moment, advertising can play the role in the other way. It doesn't have to be that same space that it was, but it does need some critical literacy around race. It does need some genuine self-reflection, and it does mean some awkward conversations, so that, for example, when you have a global marketing campaign and somewhere in another part of the world, South Asia, East Asia, says, we want to replace this black figure with a white figure. You say, no, actually, if we'd committed to this as part of who we are, we're not going to start swapping out certain racial groups for others to appease certain markets. And I know there's lots of pressure to do that. I understand the financial things, but it comes down to an ethical position. Are we willing in this moment to do the right thing? Because I genuinely believe nobody goes to work thinking, I'd like to reproduce some racial stereotypes today. Like, outside of, like, I don't know, the BNP or, the KKK advertising agency, like, none of us go to work thinking, I'd like to do some harm in the world today. How best can I do that? Most of us go to work thinking, I want to do a good job at my work. I want to be creative, and I want to engage the world in a productive way. If that's the case, then we really do need to really reconsider some of the decisions that we've made in the past, and maybe push back against those moments when we compromise and we kind of know we should really be doing this, but we don't. Like, I think if collectively and individually we all begin to shift that, then we can really use advertising and marketing as a space to embed what should be a pretty basic premise, that Black people deserve the full humanity as anybody else does, and advertising needs to play an active role in kind of pushing that message, as opposed to pushing the other messages that it has done for, sadly, so much of the 20th century.
That's such a good point about advertising sort of positively, like having a responsibility to push a different narrative. And there's lots of things happening in the industry, sort of both on a grassroots level and on an industry-wide level, to pick up on some of the things you noted, like especially around casting. Like, that's sometimes an issue where agencies will find themselves on the receiving end of pushback from brands on a global level. And one of the initiatives that, just to flag, is this initiative called Press Pause, which an organisation called Creative Equals and the IPA have put together, which just really enables people, whatever their level is in an organisation, to stop a process like that, where racism is coming to the fore, and just stop and get together as a senior team to act on it. So I just wanted to flag that for any listeners that maybe haven't heard about that. And Michael, I'd really like to get your view here, because Ben's just given us such a comprehensive overview of the sort of role of advertising in perpetuating negative stereotypes, but also the possibility for change. And I really wanted to get your view, because obviously, there's an issue around accessibility and the accessibility of sport, the funding of sport. What do you think is the role of brands, particularly at this moment in time, in terms of increasing accessibility? Ben has talked about the role of brands being active for change. And I was just wondering, from a coach's perspective, do you feel that there's a role there for them to be active in investing in the accessibility of sport in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely opportunities within the grassroots of brands to get more involved in the grassroots, where a lot of the players actually come from. That's where they start. What we see now is a lot of youngsters who maybe struggle to attain certain possibilities to buy or to get closer to the brands themselves, because they see them from such a far place, as opposed to maybe a workshop in their community center, which is sponsored by this brand, or the visibility that actually they are in that community, as opposed to just seeing them on the TV wore by X player. And then the connection is, how does the brand actually really start to make the connection with those in the grassroots? And also, I think from an accountability point of view, I think brands have a huge part to play. I agree with Matt about in my sector's football, and I know heavily that brands have a role to play within the game, particularly from a financial aspect. I've seen chairmen, I've seen businesses literally backtrack at the threat of a brand threatening that they're going to pull their funding if this doesn't happen. And so forth. When you see certain things happening within the sport that you don't agree with, then there's a possibility for brands to really start to flex their muscles, because we all know that the actual shilling counts, the pound note counts, the US dollar counts, whatever that is. So the role that brands have to play is huge in this particular space that we're currently talking about. But also I'd like to see get involved more in the grassroots to not annihilate kids. We've seen youngsters nowadays, they can't watch the Premier League because some youngsters in grassroots don't have Sky, they can't afford the BT channels. So what's happened to the normal, you know, BBC Ones or ITVs where there's nothing on it? And so what you're starting to find again is that the actual TV stations themselves, the broadcasters, are starting to create that rift between the grassroots and their product.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And Matt, I'd love to bring you in now as well, because that point about, you know, accessibility and role models, from an industry perspective, do you think that there is a danger that we're not amplifying role models enough, that there's not enough accessibility, that we're just replacing one stereotype with another?
Yeah, I think that's more the, you know, I don't think there's an absence of role models. Because I mean, there could always be more, don't get me wrong, but I think the real issue, and this as we're talking about, it's such a complicated thing, and I think sometimes in advertising we do like to, simplicity is always a good thing, or seen as a good thing, and there's a danger that we keep telling the same story of this, which in some ways continues to the myth of the black athlete. And I'd love just to see more and more. We need one of the things that I thought, Ben would be able to explain much better than I would, but one of the problems with this myth is it becomes self-fulfilling, and the more kind of athletic role models sort of young black athletes have, the more that they see that as the kind of the sort of easiest sort of route to success, or the way that they want to kind of push things forward. And I think we need to show like a broader range of role models, but also when we do have those specific role models, we need to show a much broader range of their attributes. So Ben's absolutely right, and Michael, what you were saying earlier, there's so many incredible qualities that these athletes have that sometimes, get overlooked because brands in particular want to focus on their physical attributes. And whether it's players like Lukaku who just have this side to them, which, it just doesn't get documented. It isn't part of the storytelling because it doesn't fit with that overall narrative. And we need to understand that myth has existed for all the reasons Ben outlined. It's been there for over 100 years. And we still get caught in the trap of going back to that. Whereas we really need to sort of find ways of breaking out of it and showing different sides of black athletes, rather than focusing on, this is the sort of the well-worn path that feels like it makes sense. And I think, it's worth pointing out that this is just, it really isn't just laboring the point, but this really isn't, widely known. I was looking at the, new No Room for Racism campaign from the Premier League, and some of the comments that were made in interviews from black players actually themselves so accentuated some of these issues. So, for example, Divock Origi was asked, what do black athletes bring to the game, which in itself is quite a sort of strange question, arguably. But one of the things he talked about was the athleticism that they bring to the game. So this is such a well-embedded myth, and it's so hard for us, as a society to sort of really sort of debunk it and tackle it, that advertising is going to play a massive role in doing that, and needs to do much more to do that, and to focus on, instead of creating a load more role models that come from sort of one story, and we focus on how hard they've had to work and their physical attributes and the sort of natural talents that they have, to actually sort of talk about these role models in completely different ways. And when you look at Marcus Rashford, you look at LeBron James, you look at so many characters out there at the moment that are doing incredible things in so many different ways, that can inspire a totally new generation in a completely different way. I think that's what we need to look at.
Thank you. And Ben, just turning it back to you, just in terms of the need to change this narrative, and also just like recognizing the world that we find ourselves in at the moment. Have we reached a turning point, do you think? Do you think this is a turning point?
We are at a pivot point. Absolutely. It's unclear right now the direction we're going to go in. So I really agree with the points that Matt and Michael have made. So So this idea that black athletes are powerful, strong, and quick. There's been lots of academic research that shows that these are the dominant tropes that's used to describe black athletes. and the advertising plays a role in reproducing it. every time you say that, what you're also saying is that Black people are stupid, thick, and lazy, because it's a split, and it operates this idea that Black people have these athletic, powerful traits, and therefore the opposite of that would be cognitive skills. White people are smart, and therefore, as Michael clearly shows, that makes a difference when you want to transition out of your playing career, and people can't even see you as having leadership abilities, because all they understand is your ability is linked to your physical body. And I think, you know, there was an Intel advertising campaign that I used as an example in my book from, you know, a few years ago, which was about multiplying the computing performance, you know, of Intel processors. And the image was 6 Black men bent over as athletes at the feet of a white boss who stands there proudly with his arms folded. And it says, multiply the computing performance and maximize the power of your employees. So apart from, so this automatic assumption that the Black body means power, speed is so embedded within marketing and advertising, which is why, and it's just lazy. It's just like, it's not creative. Like many years ago, I just before I did 2 things when I graduated from Loughborough University. Actually, I'm a Loughborough alumni as well. I applied to do a PhD, but I also applied to a marketing company. I think Marky had some positions, so I could have been in your business. And as I was reading the materials, one of the things it said with the application, it said, please, when you send in your application, do not include a pair of shoes. Every year we get so many people sending us a pair of shoes saying they just want to get their foot in the door. You know, don't do this. And I thought, wow, like I was so not even thinking about that. I've got no chance for this type of job, because you know, for that to be like something that these people are thinking outside the box to do, it's like, oh, I'm clearly not creative enough for a career in the advertising industries. I better go into academia. But my point is that there are amazingly smart, creative people in advertising, obviously. And what you're doing is just lazy. It's just absolutely lazy work. It's not good work. So we need to think about we've got a campaign for Western Union and sending money around the world quickly. Usain Bolt, he's fast, he's Black, he can run around. Like, it's just such tired, lazy tropes that are being reproduced, and it does material damage. I think this will be the takeaway, that the images matter, that these narratives matter, because you're telling stories about certain types of people and their attributes. Even if it's not being done explicitly and consciously, it absolutely matters. It matters when someone as skilled as Michael Johnson, and as you know, and he talked about other people. Michael Johnson himself should have a higher placed position than he does right now. And he's not going to say it because he has actually said it in other dimensions. And he's absolutely right, because someone like Michael Johnson and many other Black athletes then have to struggle and push back against these really powerful ideas. You know, as they used to say, you know, you're quick, you're Black, you're on the wing. Yeah, you're quick, you're Black, you're on the wing. That's the dominant ideal of Blackness. And so I think that we need to recognize that this is a really important moment when advertising can make a huge difference, and the advertising industries more generally. And just to give one quick example, here in America, the Washington Redskins is a racist name. It refers to Native American people as Redskins. In any other dimension of life, you wouldn't meet someone who was Native American and say, hi, Redskin. And yet one of the major NFL teams for decades has had a racist name. It changed this summer, back in July. And why did it change? Well, there's been campaigns against it for many years by activists, and people who've said, look, this is a problematic name. It changed because FedEx, who have the naming rights, who paid over $200 million, wrote a letter after pressure was put upon them to say, do you want your name associated with a racist? Do you want FedEx's name associated with the naming rights of the Washington Redskins? Within a week, they changed the name, or at least they'd taken the name off. So I think we're more aware in the corporate world of the need to act and to act ethically, but we should be doing it because it's the right thing to do, not because we're worried about an anti-racist group calling us out. I think on the other hand, we have to recognize there's a big pushback right now. There's a huge pushback against these changes that are taking place. There are a number of commentators, a number of people for whom this has all gone too far now. Why can't we just get back to the way things were before? And my fear is that unless we understand why we're doing this and have a strong ethical position, that the forces that want to push back against the idea that we should be anti-racist, those that want to push back against the idea that racism even exists, those that want to push back against Black Lives Matter, will, in a sense, kind of win the argument with some people. And they'll say, well, this is just too risky, this area, I don't want to get involved in this, I just want to concentrate on my work. But you can't do your work well unless you understand these wider issues. Like that is long gone. And if you don't, then you will constantly have issues that will blow up in your face. Your company's reputation will be at stake. The work that you do will not be good. And ultimately you could well lose your job because you haven't taken the time to think this through. And the other part of it is, who are you recruiting? Who are in the rooms when these decisions are being made? Like, have you made sure that your own companies, your own organizations are themselves thinking about these things critically, but are diverse, so that when you do pitch these ideas, some people will be saying, okay, I can see why you might have thought that, but actually this is really problematic for these reasons. If you wait until the advertising campaign is out and running and then it blows up, there's something fundamentally wrong in terms of how, like, who's in your organization, that it was that late in the process for you to recognize, hey, maybe we shouldn't be, using these stereotypes that are deeply problematic, even if we weren't aware of them.
Thank you. There's so many things to think about there, but that notion that things often, before change happens, there's often a cry of it's all gone too far before meaningful change has actually really got off the ground. And with that in mind, Michael, I'd love to bring you in here because Ben's given so many points for the audience to think about that they can put into their own work and how they approach ensuring that this becomes a priority. What would be your advice as to how people can ensure that their voices are heard, that they can enact change when it comes to this issue?
Sorry, I was on mute then. I think the main question that I would like to ask is around, your reason why. I think there has to be a purpose for what you're doing. Is it because, as I've seen with other things in governing bodies, that we think it's the right thing to do because we're getting, people speak up about it, or actually, it ticks a box. What is your purpose? Because I think once you have the purpose to it, you will really meaningfully and willingly chase the objective to get it done. So I'd like to really encourage people about the purpose of this. And also around the senior leadership positions, how best can an organization really understand these issues if there's a lack of diversity at the top table? So I would encourage those organizations and those people that are in, high level in marketing, is to look at how are you understanding the perception of what your brand is actually doing if you don't actually have access to diversity upstairs. And there's been numerous things that I've seen in England. And I think there was one recently in Italy when they tried to put out some monkeys around their celebration that this was the end of racism in Italy. I think is that right, Ben? Is that the one? Yeah. So there's two things for me: purpose, senior leadership positions, and my final point is around the athlete themselves. To play sport is a skill in itself, just like to play any instrument, to be creative. To play sport, I had to have objectives that were similar to business. I had to meet deadlines. I also had to work in a team environment. I also had to meet leadership. I also had to have strategic skills around us. So all these attributes around leadership, footballers, athletes, I'm sure Usain Bolt just doesn't run. There's an actual strategy to how he starts the race, his first 5 yards, 10 yards. And if we can start to match these traits up with your marketing, as opposed to just somebody running or power, actually think about the attributes of an athlete and the skill sets that they've used that are marrying up to business, and try and focus on them a little bit more, so we can try to break down this myth that Black athletes are just about power. speed, beast mode, as people call it.
Thank you. There's a lot of things to think about there. And Matt, could I ask you the same question to leave the audience with a takeaway?
I think for me, I mean, again, like I said, the transition that you outlined at the beginning of, it's not enough to not be racist. You need to be anti-racist means that it's important for all of us to understand this and have a say in this conversation and think about ourselves and our thoughts. And I think the biggest thing that I would urge people to do would be to understand the history, just read about the history, like look into it, all the things that Ben outlined at the beginning. Because if you don't understand the history, then essentially you are just carrying the views of other people from the past. And again, like no one, that's quite a scary thought that you're not even thinking of yourself. You're just perpetrating and carrying on the views of, people from the 20s, 40s, 50s, 60s, wherever it is. Those aren't the views that we accept today. And it's easy to see that sometimes in the more overt issues, but particularly on this issue, it's so well hidden and ingrained in us that I just keep asking people just to keep questioning, and then look at how we can tell different stories when it comes to advertising, that's for sure.
Thank you all so much for joining us today for Byte Live. We really appreciate your time. There's so many takeaways there as to how we can all push for progress and change this narrative, because stereotypes clearly stop people from reaching their full potential. So we're very grateful to you all for taking the time to delve into this topic and remind us all of the importance of having difficult conversations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.